Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to this second in the series of webinars about essentially getting ready for the clinical trial information system. As we know, that's now gone live since January 31 of this year and will be mandatory for all new trials conducted in the European Union starting January of next year. Today, we're going to focus in on preparing the content for the clinical trial information system, some thoughts around that, and how to conform your source content best for the EU clinical trial regulations. So with that, just one housekeeping item. If you have any questions for us, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So please type them. You should see at the bottom of your screen ask a question button, so please use that. So with that, Francine, I'm going to turn over to you to introduce yourself, then I'll introduce myself, and then we'll share the slides.
Sure. Thank you, Thomas. My name is Francine Lane. I am the VP of Global Transparency and the Senior Director of Product at Informa. And I have been working with disclosure-related topics for the better part of 17 years now, I think it is. And working many of those years with my colleague Thomas, and we are very happy to talk to you today about CTIS.
Thank you, Francine. And I'm Thomas Wicks. I'm the head of data and partnerships at Informa Pharma Intelligence. My role since 2007 has been to work to understand the requirements, the industry trends, the expectations from participants, from patients, industry critics, transparency advocates. I bring that back to support Francine and the development team for the products and the services teams that we have. And I also lead the advisory services, helping organizations prepare their SOPs and policies, and do some audits of past compliance. So that's kind of my experience. It's looking at that from understanding where things are and especially also where they are going. So with that, let me share my screen. Give me just a second. I will go in and share the presentation. Share. So you should start seeing my slide show up now. Let me just pop my camera back on again. So just to confirm everyone, I'm sure you can see the screen now. So as I said, we're going to talk today about preparing content for CTIS and the EU CTR, as we call it, dotting the I's and crossing the T's. We've done our quick introduction, but just to give you a general overview of what we're going to be talking about today. First, we'll give a very high-level overview of the global scope of disclosure. Although we are focused on CTIS, the data that you are disclosing in the European Union on those registries are also being disclosed elsewhere. So it's really important to keep in mind that you're not optimizing just for one place where data are being submitted and ultimately made public, but you're trying to manage a process that cuts across the world. So that's an important thing to consider. So we will go through this, and first we're going to start off with the discussion of global disclosure. And for that, I'm going to turn it over back to Francine. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. So as most of you are certainly aware, clinical trial disclosure is a global endeavor. Over the course of the past 25 years, registries have been established in all 6 continents. Thomas, if you want to activate the next slide. There are registries on all 6 continents covering all the regions in the globe where clinical trials are conducted. So Antarctica is not included in there. There are over 40 government-sponsored registries, and these don't even include the disease-specific registries. So you can see on this slide that the majority of studies, at least at the moment, are being conducted with sites in the US, and that's probably biased to the registration on clinicaltrials.gov as the preeminent global registry. But you can see all of the little maroon dots on this map are different registries in the different countries that have the registries, and some of them start blurring together because there are multiple registries in small spaces like Japan and in places in Europe. But you can see that the dots are covering all areas of the globe, maybe not as consistently in some places as others, but there are certainly everywhere. And they tend to be increasing. I think, Thomas, you have an estimate like 1 or 2 per year?
Yeah, it's just about 2 years since 2000.
Yeah, so registries are not going away. We can say that. And when you start counting in all the disease-specific registries that may take information from these more formal and regulatory registries, your information is everywhere on the globe. If you could go to the next slide, please. The availability of information. So we have information on the same study that may be registered on clinicaltrials.gov. It may be going into UDRCT, the EU Clinical Trials Register. This is, obviously with CTIS, this will be a slightly different register. In Japan, you may have the trial running. You'll get the information in, in different registries. Sorry, that was probably China, and then Japan, and then you have a medical journal, and you have the pharma letter. So all of this information is going from global and local registries to manuscripts, to newspaper articles, journals, medical journals, and other publications. And you need to be aware that this information is available, because some of the regulators do look, and it will impact what you can redact, for example. And this has nothing to the point of eventually these industry watchdogs, or transparency advocates, as we like to call them, will also at some point in time likely be comparing the information that you make public in one place versus the other, in as much as you can control what gets published and when it gets published and if it gets updated. It all leads to a very complicated global landscape of disclosure. Go ahead to the next slide. So your information that gets made public goes through different stages. So it obviously will start out internally with your protocol for your study design and the basics of what you're studying, and your CSR for the results of that study. That information will be augmented by your systems that help you run the trial and collect the data from the trial. So this could be your CTMS system or your CDMS, your trial master files, EDCs. All of that information will come together to augment with your more static information. And it will often go into a disclosure system. And that disclosure system can be a commercial disclosure system, such as what we offer. It could be a homegrown disclosure system. It could even be a registry, for example, although those tend to be a little less shareable. But eventually, you want to get your data prepared to be made public. You want to review, approve your information to make sure it's what your organizations are comfortable with making public, and to make sure the correct people are taking a look at this, so that you don't run into patent problems, for example, if something is disclosed before the patent is filed in a certain country. We do have anecdotal evidence that this has happened in the past, where results have been posted someplace which an organization lost their patent exclusivity because this information was made public before the patent was filed. So this information goes on trial registries. Many sponsors have their own trial websites because they want to promote the clinical trials that they are running, as well as promote the different therapeutic areas that they're focused on, even if they're not running the trial potentially. The information is also very, very welcome by patient advocacy groups and recruiters. They use all of this information to inform their stakeholders, and their stakeholders could be patients, or often are patients, and they want to participate in clinical trial, and they want to know what's happening in their therapeutic area space.
And if I may add to that, so this is one of the reasons we will now soon switch over to a much more CTIS, EU CTR focused discussion. But to give you that broader perspective, I think it was important to see kind of the world in which CTIS fits. And for example, the recruiters and patient advocacy groups and so on, they're very much interested in plain language information, whether it's plain language information about the protocol or results. So thinking that through, because most of the registries allow for certain elements to be in plain language, we'll talk about that soon, is it's just helpful to see that that information is consistent everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's no such thing as local disclosure, I would say.
Indeed. So with that, let me switch on to Francine. You're going to take this as well, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. So there are certain risks that are inherent with public disclosure. And we talked a little bit about this already, but the need to harmonize your editorial decisions that are made by maybe people that are not part of your core disclosure group. So a lot of organizations may outsource their disclosure responsibilities to local affiliates who are very knowledgeable about local requirements and registries. They may go to different partner organizations or CROs. And so you want to make sure that everyone is on the same page, because you want to avoid that there's inconsistent information being submitted to these various places across the globe. So primarily registries, but it could also be other local registries or things like that. You want to make sure that what you're disclosing doesn't cause you issues when it comes time to redact or anonymize information. So especially when the topic is around company confidential information, and some of the redactions that are done in Europe today with Policy 70. The Policy 70 group, it's not currently active, but the people at the EMA reviewing their Policy 70 submissions and the areas that were requested for redactions by the sponsor could go out and look for this information on various publicly available websites and other things. And if they found it, they would disallow that redaction. So many of these organizations didn't know that this data was out there and made public, and they were very surprised that they couldn't redact it. The next option, Thomas, disclosing company confidential information goes very close with the redactions, but there could be information, as we mentioned earlier, anecdotally with patent protection. There may be some company information that you don't expect to be out there, but because your local affiliates or partners are responsible for the disclosures, you may not know that they're putting it out there. And then potential patent rejection. If information gets out before patents can be filed, then that is a reason why the patent won't be granted to the organization, and that could have very significant financial ramifications for an organization, especially for smaller organizations. I will say, if you're a large pharma company with, I don't know, 1,000 different products that you're marketing, losing patent exclusivity for one of those is going to hurt, but it probably won't bring down your entire business. If you are a small organization with a handful of products, this could be survival. So this is not something that should be taken lightly, and it's very important to know that these risks exist so that you can work to mitigate them.
And just to support what Francine was saying, we know of at least 2 instances where this has happened. One was a patent rejection for a new indication in Canada based on information that had been disclosed. Now, I don't know if it was an affiliate or a CRO, but it was disclosed on a registry before it had been run past the IP attorneys. So this just talks about, you need to be in control of the information that's being disclosed. So the first step is knowing where it must be managed.
And giving guidelines to the people who are doing those disclosures for you.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about globally, because as we said, there's no such thing of disclosing only in a local area, and that's true for the EU clinical trial, the CTIS and clinical trial regulation as well. So now that we've done that, let's kind of zoom in and focus on the EU clinical trial regulations. So there's a couple of considerations that you should be aware of when you will be using CTIS and running these trials that are different from how it used to work under UDRA-CT or how it may work in some other places. And the first area is that CTIS and the EU regulation were designed for basically maximizing transparency, I would say. Almost all of the information that you will be providing through CTIS will be made public. There are certain exceptions where you may have private versions of documents and redacted versions of documents, but those are going to be very limited. and almost everything that you put into CTIS will be made public. This includes the information that you are discussing with the member states, RFIs and responses to RFIs and things of that nature. Modifications, these will be processed sequentially instead of concurrently, because it's all going through the same process. All the member states are going through the same process, and you're not negotiating individually with each member state. So this may be a difference in the process that you're currently following, and you may need to adjust some of your time schedules to make sure that you're taking this into account. And then the last area will be deferrals. This is one of the biggest areas of difference, and that until you mess it up, you probably won't notice it. And I'm sure that somebody will mess this up. If you wish to defer registering your study, making some of your study information public, either the registration or the results of said studies, you need to submit your deferral. It's a checkbox, I think, when you're submitting your application. In most places, at least today, if you're looking to defer something, either you can defer it at the time where results are due. So you may be asking to defer the results if you are, for example, studying a non-approved product or a non-approved indication in the US. You can defer your results for a little bit. In the US, you can choose not to register your phase 1 study until the product is being approved. If you wish to defer that, you as a sponsor take that. You have the ability to influence that, because phase 1 studies are not required on clinicaltrials.gov or in the US. And then in Europe, phase 1 studies on non-pediatric populations are not made public today. They will be made public using under the EU clinical trial regulation. So if there's a reason, especially for early phase studies, that you wish to control that, you have to think about that when your regulatory groups are making the submission. And it's not necessarily like in big flashing lights that this is where you select the deferral. So be aware that that is there, and that is going to be a consideration that you have to make early on in the process, and not later on once the trial is almost complete. And then this, if you've been on one of our CTIS webinars previously, this is the scope of information that is included on CTIS. So you may have seen this before. You have your full dossier that you submit when you are looking for your trial authorization. You have to submit your investigator brochure. There's RFIs and notifications. RFIs are requests for information, and this is the formal process for a member state to communicate with the trial sponsor. And this happens within the CTIS system. The response is response to the RFI within the clinical trial, within the CTIS system. There are also notifications when certain milestones have been met or when certain things happen on the trial. The results in the plain language summaries are included in this. The trial protocol, as well as a plain language protocol summary, is included in CTIS and the information required under the regulation. Subject information sheets, IMPD information, a lot of IMPD information, and characteristics about the study. So all of this information is going to go into the CTIS. It's a lot, and almost all of this, at least in some way, shape, or form, will be made public.
Thank you, Francine. And we will get, I saw there's some questions about this, and we'll get to those at the end. Just one housekeeping thing that I forgot to mention. A PDF of the slides will be available, and a recording. So for those of you who wish to forward a recording to colleagues, that'll be an option as well. So now let's talk a little bit about the practicalities of making your submissions and how you want to plan that, given the context of all the data that are being disclosed and some of the requirements, such as the plain language summaries of results. So one thing you want to do is really think about a standard disclosure data set. This goes for CTIS and any other registry where you want to disclose. This helps you avoid this inconsistent disclosure. It makes sure that everyone around the world who is disclosing on your behalf understands what is acceptable content to be disclosed, so you can manage patent challenges, and you can eliminate or at least minimize challenges with subsequent redactions that you wish to make. by having a better control over what has to be disclosed. We recommend doing something like having a disclosure template. For example, in our system, we have some templates for that. But for those of you outside, you can start with the WHO registration data set. Let me just show you what that looks like. These are the main pieces of information that virtually all clinical trial registries in some form or another require, and they are part of clinical trial applications, so they will be part of the submission that you make to CTIS. Having a structured, simplified version of all of this information is very useful as a starting point. Some organizations, for example, create a little template that has these fields in it and make that as an annex or a part of the clinical protocol as it's being developed. So that's sort of the agreed upon disclosure language as a core starting set. One idea some organizations do, if they don't have a template, they will register all trials on clinicaltrials.gov, whether or not they must be by US law. They print that registration out, and that becomes the standard acceptable registration data set and part of the CTA submission process in other countries, including the CTIS in Europe. So that's kind of where you want to think through. Now let's think about like some of the disclosure considerations when you're thinking about preparing your clinical trial application and your protocol registrations and so on. There are some things that need to be emphasized in the protocol authoring process to really come across and get some clarity in what you're doing. So one is really having an alignment between how the objectives of the trial are supported by the endpoints. So every objective in the trial should have some supporting endpoint, and every endpoint should be aligning with some kind of objective of the study. If there are measures really that need to be documented, how that's going to be measured, there needs to be an explanation, right? So if you have a pain scale, then provide some information in the protocol about the pain scale. Otherwise, your colleagues who are making these publicly available will have to start editorializing, and then you might start introducing differences that you don't wish to introduce. Again, sorry, this is the scales. That's where you want to indicate also best and worst case scores and so on. So that has to be very clear from the get-go. If you're doing an objective, include the measurement of the objective. How are you going to assess that that objective has been achieved? And then ultimately also classify endpoints. So are they primary, secondary, exploratory? It's very important. For example, many registries require you to disclose all primary and all secondary endpoints. Some don't require exploratory or other endpoints. So making it very clear in the protocol, the type of endpoint that you're discussing, and that has to be then consistent throughout. Unless you do a protocol amendment, a tertiary doesn't get to be disclosed in a journal article as a secondary, right? That is one of the things that folks are looking at, transparency advocates are looking at, especially to make sure that there's not been outcome switching or endpoint switching there. And then also best practice would be to have some kind of templates in place, especially when we're talking about endpoints, so that that's a way to ensure, and I'll give you an example of that, that every objective has one or more endpoints. Define all your terms. This is something that people don't often think about, but depending on where in the organization you are, you may have multiple definitions of a study start date, or what does it mean to have completed enrollment, and so on. For adverse events, summarize those non-serious adverse events in text, not just in the tables, figures, and listings. And then here's an example of this objectives and endpoints. And I think it's really clever. Not many companies are doing this yet. But this is a sort of a cleaned up, anonymized version of what I think would be a best practice, or would consider a best practice. Is you see on the left side of your screen the primary objective and a secondary objective for a trial, and then how that aligns with the primary endpoint. You can see it's sort of a good overview that there's an objective that actually has an endpoint and how those align. So that is a very clean way to do things, and ensures a lot of consistency down the line, not just for CTIS, but just in general. But for CTIS as well, this is a clean way to do that for everyone. So that was just sort of some general information that might be useful, that might be helpful in the process of preparing information for submission to CTIS and other registries. Now we're going to toggle over into incorporating plain language into your disclosure. So what we have is we have multiple data sources that are bringing in information that needs to be, that will ultimately become public. And so one of the things that we strongly encourage, and that is actually required by law in the UK and in Europe, is that information also be provided in plain language. And incidentally, it's also solidly hinted at in the Declaration of Helsinki. So if your company subscribes to the Declaration of Helsinki as part of your ethics commitments or in the informed consent, that's another reason where you may want to really emphasize the importance of plain language content. So what we have is there's information that's relevant to patients and potential participants. And you will recognize the bolded items here are really from that WHO template, those WHO registration data set that we discussed earlier is a good way to start organizing the information that you plan to disclose. As I go on, you see some of these have turned red, and those are really elements that can be described in plain language. Most registries accept it. So the brief title, or whatever you want to call it, there's going to be different names for it, but nonetheless, a description, those can be written in plain language that is acceptable and preferred by many registries, and can be also incorporated into your protocol, be part of your CTA submission. So that is very much a best practice, because it also supports, I apologize, sorry. It supports submissions to the registries. It helps with recruiters. It may help with patient communication. It can be baked into the informed consent form, because quite frankly, although the idea behind the informed consent form is that it should be plain language, very often that's drifted a little bit from its purpose because of all the legal language that has to be baked in. And also, if you start this from the beginning in the protocol, you now are also supporting the plain language summary of the protocol that you're submitting as part of your CTIS application. So here's just some examples of things that you can build into the product from the very beginning, which then has multiple uses down the line. So what are some of the sources for plain language information? So the source document, we talked already about it, is the protocol. So really, as much as possible, incorporate plain language elements from the very beginning as you're authoring the protocol, instead of having it. I know the primary purpose of a protocol is sort of a scientific document, but this is one way to facilitate downstream effects. And frankly, it's good practice, because if you can't describe something in plain language, you may not fully understand it yourself. That's what I've always been taught. And then maybe even considering a plan to including a plan for plain language summaries in the protocol. Like, how are you going to pull this data together? What elements are you going to include? An example of that is companies often think through, should a plain language summary of results include only the primary endpoint, or should we highlight some secondary endpoints? It's cleaner if you pre-identify the secondary endpoints that you plan to include, if any, in the plain language summary, so that it doesn't appear that you're sort of selectively disclosing things in that plain language summary. I know we touched on this already, but in the informed consent, wherever possible, incorporate plain language that can be understood by someone with a 6th to 8th grade education. So roughly 11, 12-year-old should be able to read that and get a general sense of what the trial is about. That can be a challenge, but there we are. Clinical study reports. So this is something that folks aren't necessarily doing yet, but again, it's a good best practice. If you're thinking about the studies, the CSR synopsis, there's nothing to stop you from including a plain language synopsis in that as well, especially if you're not going to provide a public plain language summary of results. So if you're conducting a trial outside of the European Union or the UK, right now there's no legal requirements. Nonetheless, patients and participants especially expect and deserve to have a summary of results, so that they can understand what the trial was that they went through. So consider building in some form of that. It can be somewhat higher level. Maybe the one that you put into the CSR doesn't have all the icons and so on. It's perhaps more in the structure of what the UK expects, which is something I recommend. If you haven't seen it yet, go out to the National Health Authority and see what they're suggesting for the plain language. It's more text heavy. Another optional source, this isn't to write things in plain language in the statistical analysis plan, but when you are authoring a plain language summary of results, do cross-reference with the SAP to make sure that nothing's being missed. So this is maybe less common to do that, but nonetheless, it's helpful for the author of the plain language summary to review like all the information that's in the SAP to check off to make sure that things that ought to have been included are included. And then as you are getting ready to do a plain language authoring, which all of you running trials in Europe will have to do, including in the UK, one, develop a plain language glossary. So this is a dictionary that translates your medical terms into a language that can be understood by someone without a scientific education or without a clinical background. And that can be quite difficult. Now, there are tools for that, and we have some resources that are included in this slide presentation at the end. We won't get into them today, but there's hyperlinked resources I would recommend. For example, MRCT, the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center at Harvard and Brigham. They have a very nice trial glossary that you may want to select, have a look at. The other thing is then develop a plain language summary template so that your plain language summaries are more consistent, so that they're structured the same way, thinking through about how you're going to use graphics, and you know, the depth. Really think through very hard about how long they need to be. Preferred is like 5 or 6 pages, and that can be a really big struggle. So give yourself enough time to implement a process for plain language summary authoring. We've seen some organizations that on their first plain language summary took upward of 18 months to publish it. It's not that hard to write them necessarily, but then the process of getting the organization to accept that this is an adequate plain language summary, to go through the battles of pushing back on the reintroduction of scientific terms, because plain language summaries are not going to be any less accurate, but they are going to be less specific. And that loss of specificity can be a struggle, because that's not how most people are taught to author clinical documents. The more specific, the clearer things are, but that doesn't necessarily help patients and participants in their understanding. So there's going to be a fairly long cultural process of going through the first plain language summary. We share that only as a warning, because at the latest studies that must be then registered on the clinical trial information system in Europe, that's mandatory as of January of 2023. As soon as those complete within 6 to 12 months, so their completion date, plain language summaries are required. And remember, any study that completed in the UK since September of last year also needs a plain language summary of results. So you may be running out of time to establish a process. Now, most companies don't take 18 months, but it can still be a multi-month process to figure out your approach, your templates, your glossaries, thoughts around when do you include a patient review panel and so on. So give yourself plenty of time. And this is one area where I would recommend you consider bringing in expert resources for at least the first few to get the ball rolling so that you can build that muscle. This is not usually done by people who are medical writers focused more on submission documents. This is a unique skill. And so next we're going to talk more about, sorry, let me just go back up a second here. We just talked about how to think through plain language. Now, we didn't go into the depths because this discussion today is about preparing for those things. So now we're going to talk about preparing for redaction and anonymization. So this is for those colleagues of yours who are preparing the protocol, who are preparing the CSR, who are preparing the data. What are some best practices, some thoughts that they will want to incorporate into their documents? So with that, keep in mind, redaction is going to come down the line, and redaction or anonymization really has two elements that you can remove from the documents. Personally identifiable information is typically removed wholesale, so that's fairly clear, but that can still be difficult because you're also anonymizing information. So where there are data about participants or let's say study officials, investigators, a lot of that has to be removed. And that can be made more difficult if you didn't think through the structure of your document. So, for example, avoid participant information. When you're adding participant information, avoid pronouns, especially in patient narratives. So instead of saying she, say the patient or the participant, because that's just another level of opportunity to re-identify. Then avoid in the patient information verbatims with quotes from investigators. So for example, the example here is she fell out of her wheelchair in the shower. Now the family member whose, mother or sister or wife was in the trial may realize that that's the patient narrative about their relative. So that's a way for things to get re-identified because it's hard to scrub all of that in all the patient narratives. So just avoid it. There's a certain level of detail that is unnecessary. When you are including patient IDs including patient IDs in images and tables, so avoid that if at all possible. If patient IDs are required, so that may be the case that there's some places where you can't avoid it. One challenge that redactors have is if you copy paste tables into the documents that are images, because they can't be edited, and then you have to start pasting little black boxes over it, and that can be very tedious and is more error prone than anything else. So then paste the tables in with selectable text so that text can be highlighted and boxed over that way. At very least, if you are having to do images, then make sure that, let's say the second column is the patient ID and you've got 10 pages of those tables, just make it the second column is always the patient ID so that it's really consistent and makes it much simpler. A small change to make, but can be very impactful in the disclosure. So this is all based, by the way, all these recommendations are based from colleagues who do redactions and anonymizations, and these are the things that they found most difficult to deal with, and this would be helpful to everyone down the line. Another element, and I touched on this very briefly already, is thinking through the clinical trial staff. So when you're talking about study or sponsor staff, not only avoid adding names of study staff with their organizational title. So instead of saying, like the vice president of clinical operations at biotech XYZ, just say the head of whatever, the study lead. So put their study role in, because that way LinkedIn can't be used to try to re-identify people. Don't put in contact information. I mean, I hope most of us aren't using fax numbers anymore, but phone or email or anything like that. And also avoid incorporating resumes, CVs, or certificates. And if you do have to incorporate them, then add them as an appendix that can be dropped off. That's cleaner than trying to scatter that throughout the documents. Other potential identifiers, things that people don't necessarily think about, is if you add personal identifiers and bookmarks. So if you have a bookmark with a patient ID or name or study admin, or providing treatment allocation and group information throughout the document. Those are all difficult things to redact and manage. And then there's additional considerations. So other things that we see a lot that make things difficult is, so for example, limit duplication that requires duplicate redaction. So the example of that is, sometimes people will put in a table, with patient narrative information. And then the table is followed by text with the same information. And again, that's like one is enough. That's lean authoring, right? You really want to get down to the point where you're not constantly repeating the same information throughout. I know there was reasons to do that in the past. There's no more reasons to do that now. It's not considered best practice at this point in many documents to constantly repeat information. If you are including a sample CRF, it sounds a little odd because it's a sample, but use clearly fake patient IDs like XXX or 000. Don't even use 1234. Make it very obvious that this is fake, because otherwise it'll just trigger the redaction tools that people are using. Aim to keep page numbering consistent between CSRs and the PDF copies. That can happen sometimes when you print things off to PDF, the page numberings go off. That makes it very difficult for the redaction teams, because they are constantly cross-referencing. And the last thing I would say is that foreign language pages are out of scope for these submissions, so move them to an appendix or remove them. It's just another level of redaction that is unnecessary when you're talking about foreign language elements. So what this really kind of comes down to is this has to do with a medical writing with a disclosure mindset. This is true for CTIS. So a lot of these things that I said is like your CTIS submissions should consider all of these elements. What we're talking about is there are regulatory requirements in a submission. So when you're writing things, you're having to consider that the documents that will be part of a submission for clinical trial applications and marketing authorizations, there are regulatory requirements around disclosure that have to be met by pulling information out of the source documents, which is why we talked a little bit about those things you can consider in the protocol and the CSR to make it easier for the disclosure teams to do their work, and to make it more consistent, not just easier, as multiple editorial choices are made, that things remain consistent. Incorporating plain language, because that's required both for regulatory submissions now and for disclosure purposes. And often your organization will have transparency commitments to support the patient community. So you'll see that more and more. It's a best practice. Leading pharma companies, biotechs, are already providing plain language summaries well ahead of what the regulations require, because it's the right thing to do. And think about redactions, right? So we just had a long section where we talked about what are the redaction requirements for all of these documents as you get them ready for submission. And then there's other uses of disclosed information that you may want to consider and think about as you're authoring the document. So engagement is an example. So sometimes the data that you are posting to the registries that you're submitting to CTIS are also made available on your company's trial website. Your organization's trial website doesn't have to be just commercial sponsors, of course. So you want to make sure that the data that are being disclosed on your corporate trial website or your organization's trial website are more patient-friendly. So that's another reason to incorporate plain language. The whole purpose of this is to communicate and engage with potential participants and patients. All of this information can be also leveraged for recruiting. So again, the more standardized that language is, the easier it is to support those kind of recruiting efforts. Understand that critics are looking. So transparency advocates and industry critics are looking at disclosure practices. They are finding inconsistencies between journals and registrations. They're finding that clinical trial applications were submitted and then not updated, and suddenly there are amendments that were never made but are clearly implied by the journal article. So there's consistency that doesn't exist always, and causes it can cause public embarrassment for your organization as those are highlighted. And then remember also, and this is just something as an aside, maybe you don't realize this, but the data you're disclosing is also being viewed by industry analysts, financial analysts. So, I mean, your investor relations group will definitely know this, but the data are everywhere. They're being used by patients, they're being used by potential participants, by industry groups, by analysts, by critics. The data are everywhere. And of course, health authorities, are looking at that as well. And I just wanted to give a special shout out to some contributors from Clarity Docs who really helped with some of the redaction elements and the plain language. So Courtney Parsons, Devaki Tharavaja, and Kim Green. So with that, we're going to switch over to the question and answer session. Again, as a reminder, if you have any questions, at the bottom of your screen, you should have a screen there. And I'm going to toggle over to start reading some of these myself. And Francine, I don't know if you've had a chance to start reviewing some of them.
Yes, Thomas, I have been madly trying to look for answers, which is why I haven't been paying close enough attention to you.
Wait, all my pearls of wisdom have gone to waste? Sorry.
I have been answering. So there are some questions, and I've provided some links primarily to a Q&A document that the EMA has put out, and they're now on version 5 of it. And let's see. I think if you would Google, for example, you should all hopefully see the URL that I've put in. This is a fantastic document for you to look at. It's called Clinical Trial Regulation EU number 536/2014, Questions and Answers version 5. Yeah. I have provided this URL to answer a couple of these questions, and I'll run over those really quickly.
Francine, sorry, yeah. I think if you provide questions, I don't know that everyone sees the URL. Let's make sure.
I believe I made the answers public.
Oh, okay, good. I was going to say, otherwise, we have a slide called Appendix. If you can also copy it there, that will be useful.
Yes, I absolutely can copy it there. However, I can answer a couple of these questions that had answers to them. There's one question about the foreign language guidelines for documents and disclosure, if it's required for all 24 EU languages. The Q&A document does talk about what the language requirements are for different documents. In general, the language requirements are going to be driven by where you're conducting the study. There's not, unless you know differently, Thomas, I believe it's not required to submit in all the EU languages, only in the languages that are required for the countries that you may be running your trials in. So local member states may have their own requirements about that. I know, for example, Sweden does have a local language requirement. So if you're running a trial in Sweden, you'll have to translate the information into Swedish.
Yeah, there was the other request from the redactors, or the suggestion from the folks who are managing redaction, was that, excuse me, some CSRs, for example, might include a patient narrative or some inserted element that is from a site in China, and now they have a Chinese document inserted. So that was kind of the ask, was to avoid doing that. Beyond the language requirements from your CTIS application, that you have no choice.
Right. I mean, I think there'll be some information. The idea is that as many people as possible should be able to access your information. And there's always costs associated with them, right? And so you want to make sure that it's not too high of a cost for you. But the balance is to make it accessible to people. Sorry, I am putting this link in as we speak so that you'll be able to see this potentially real time. Yeah. Let me insert the link. Oops, what did I? Right, here we go. And then there was a similar question, and I believe this was around, what are the requirements, or why am I saying that plain language summaries are required? And it will have, the link should come in there in just a second, Thomas, but this is the name of the document. There is a section in here in Annex 1, point D24. The regulation states that there does need to be a protocol summary provided. The guidance, or this Q&A document, recommends that it be provided in lay language, or language that is accessible to all. So that's where that requirement comes from. There's a lot of discussion about this. This is an area that didn't get very much attention until, at least in my circles, didn't get very much attention until very recently, and now it's kind of blowing up. So this is an area that kind of flew under the radar for a while. Is the plain language summary the same as the protocol synopsis? I believe that the answer that I would give is there are two lay summaries. that are typically kind of considered required. One is a lay or one is the protocol synopsis, which is recommended to be provided in lay language. And the second one is the plain language summary of results. So there's two of them. So I can't specifically say if that's the same one, but I do believe that you're probably referencing the protocol summary, which is recommended in lay language. And just to be clear, when you're looking for deferrals, thank you for putting these deferrals up. These are not deferrals, as I understand it, of submitting the data to CTIS. It's a deferral on when this information is made public. So any of these deferrals, they don't work like clinicaltrials.gov, where you can say, I don't want to submit my results for 2 years. You still have to submit them. They will defer publishing them. So it doesn't change your timelines for submitting this information.
And also to be clear that you can see that category 2 and 3 trials, so those are phase 2, 3, and 4 studies, there's no option to defer results. There are, so you see this clinical trial result summary. This is a summary of the EMA requirements that was published in Pink Sheets. The source document is linked here to the EMA, so there's more detail behind this. This is meant to be a quick, it's not even that quick, but it's a summary. So you can see the main things that you can defer have to do with phase 1 studies. There's more deferral options. For the category 2 trials, it's usually a 5-year window for some of the data, some of the documents, I mean, that can be deferred. And just as a reminder, you must request that deferral at the same time that you submit the CTA. If you do it later, it'll be rejected. So that's an important process refinement checklist item for you.
There's another question that has come up about, and I spelled this poorly, let me fix that, about language requirements. I don't know, honestly, if the language requirements are showing up in the regulation, but your local member states may have language requirements. They have their local laws and regulations that they follow, and they can choose not to, or to have these additional requirements put onto authorizing your trial. So there are still some local requirements that you will have to submit to, and the language would be one of those potentially local requirements when running trials. And I know we have about 7 more minutes until we hit the top of the hour. So let's see. Do you have any of these that you want to take a crack at?
Let me just have a quick look. I
can answer one of these. One of these is, in the previous session, we mentioned submitting 2 versions of certain documents, one for the competent authorities or one for the member states, and one for public release. When this option is available, it's not available for every single document, and I don't have a good line on which documents it is available for and which ones it's not available for at the moment. But it will be a separate option to upload a redacted version when that is available. As I said, it's not available for everything, but those redacted versions would be the ones that are available for public, and the non-redacted versions would be internal to CTIS. But that option, as I understand it, is not available on every single document, and it will be whichever ones are available, and you'll just see that's an option to add that kind of a document.
Yeah, and I see the question here also about adding a plan for the plain language summaries. Been discussed multiple times, but are there any drawbacks? I'm trying to think what would be the drawback. I suppose it's making a commitment that you then don't want to live up to at the end, right? If you promise to disclose data on some secondary endpoint and then you would rather not at the end, I suppose. It's something that to be honest, it's a best practice that we've gotten a recommendation on from plain language summary authors who have specialized in this for a long time and have written many of these. to avoid the discussions at the time of authoring the plain language summary of what should be included. So it's a clean upfront step. You may want to keep it more general, sort of have a policy that in your organization you only disclose, you only include primary endpoints. The challenge is sometimes in some studies, the secondary endpoints are extremely important and medically relevant to the participants. So then how do you decide beforehand to avoid the potential issue of, I won't say cherry picking, that's such a pejorative, but how do you make that a clear case for why did you include this secondary endpoint and not that secondary endpoint? In the end, all the data have to be disclosed publicly anyway. They just might not be disclosed in a way that is easily accessible to the patient. So that's the other part is, you know, on clinicaltrials.gov and on other registries and CTIS, ultimately all the results are going to be public for all secondary endpoints. So then the question is, how do you pick the ones you want to explain to participants, and what's your process for that? And maybe you describe the process for selecting them rather than pre-identifying them.
There is another question. If it's known that the proposed maximum deferral times will always be accepted, from what I've heard, so we don't have any specific evidence of this yet, but what I have heard through different conversations is that should not be assumed that if you say, I want to defer this up to 7 years past the end of the trial, that will necessarily be accepted. I think the reporting member state has the option to say, no, you have to come back with a different answer.
And so the next question, Francine, I don't actually have an answer to this. Is it mandatory to include a section in the study protocol about the deferral? I don't think you have to note in the protocol that you're going to defer these documents. You just have to.
That's an excellent question. I haven't heard that.
Yeah.
However, what I will say is you do have to identify in the protocol what you consider the end of trial. Because as far as the EMA is concerned, the end of trial is when the trial ends within the European Economic Area. So if you define the end of trial as to when the trial ends globally, you need to state that within the protocol, because your results will be expected after the end of trial in all member states unless otherwise stated. So you will be inputting when you will be submitting your results. And if that date is different than, let's say, a year after the end of trial in all member states, they're going to look at that and say, why is this? Your protocol doesn't say that. Your protocol doesn't state that you're not going to be running your numbers at the end of the global trial. And they may push back on that if you don't define that in the protocol. So that is one of the things that they have stated, that they'll look at the trial for the definition of the end of trial. So they'll look at the protocol for the definition of end of trial.
Thank you, Francie. That just leaves us one last question, and I honestly don't have the answer. I may have to follow up. I can see who asked it about confirming that the entire investigator brochure has to be disclosed. That I am not 100% sure, and I'd have to follow up unless, Francine, you happen to have a direct answer for that.
I do not know. I think if they don't allow a redacted version of it, unless there's some particular sections of it that they will, for some reason, not include. But if it's uploading a PDF, I don't think that they can choose to publish, pages 1 through 5 of the PDF, but not 6 through 10. So that if they don't, if it is on the scale to be published, and it likely is, that if they don't allow you to upload a redacted version, that it will be made public. I think that should be the going assumption unless you find out otherwise.
Yeah. So I can ask someone and get a follow-up to that. So with that, we're right up at the hour. I really appreciate the many questions that came in. Let me just sort of toggle back over to one slide I wanted to share, which is our contact information. So I can be reached at thomas.wicks@Informa. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. If you have any questions, send them to me, send them to Francine. Francine is also the chair of the DIA disclosure community, so that's another place where you can reach her. If we didn't answer some of your questions today, if you had some offline discussions you'd like to have, please do follow up with us. We hope you found this useful, and as I said, the slides and the recording will be made available in follow-up to this session today to everyone. Thank you so much for your attendance, and have a great day.
Bye-bye. Thank you.